I want to say just a couple of words of introduction. I don't want to break in too much to our first session. And really explain what the idea of this is. We hope that this, of course, is going to be the first of a series. The idea is to bring together 20 people within a field, grouped around a question, actually even more than being within a field, to debate freely. And that's why we've arranged the programme so that for every hour of people actually speaking, there is an hour of free discussion, which we hope can roam not only around all the subjects raised in those papers, but also broader issues in relation to our main question. So the idea was that you early career people, your papers were circulated in advance, and we hope everybody has read them all, so that the discussion can proceed then from a sort of summarising that you present to us. Our senior guest speakers haven't circulated their papers in advance, and they're going to speak for a little bit longer, but we hope that there'll be as much equality in circulation of discussion as possible. I should explain somewhat how I divided them up, and any errors are entirely mine. They were divided partly to try and fit you together with the overall topic of our 5 external experts. But sometimes they may seem to wander a bit from the central question, and we hope again that that will mean that we can think outside our expected structures. And how we'll do it is to have 4 papers in succession and afterwards begin to discuss all of them. Not so much as questions but as discussions, but it can go in the way that this group chooses that it should go. So it remains now for me to thank very warmly Professor Sir Mark Walport from the Wellcome Institute, from the Wellcome Trust, for being willing to come to us today, and also for allowing us to go and visit the museum later on today. Sir Mark studied medicine at Cambridge and then at a number of London hospitals. His expertise, his field of sorry, I can't see anything because the light's off on my right, the text is small. Your clinical and research interests focus on immunology and particularly the genetics of rheumatic diseases. He's served and chaired on a large number of committees, of national committees, and he's earned a number of prizes. And I'm not going to go through them all because they're in the information you have. He became a governor of the Wellcome Trust in the year 2000 and the director in the year 2003. So that's you 6 years into this important role, and we're very grateful indeed for coming today.
Thank you very much indeed. Probably easiest if I stand. So actually I do believe in reading the exam question, and I'm going to talk about the topic of the meeting, which is what role do museums play in the globalisation of culture. And I must say, when I went to medical school, I never thought that years later I would be giving talks on museums. But actually what goes around does come around, because I spent my gap year working in the British Museum. And I've always had a fondness for museums. And actually one of the enormous pleasures of working at the Wellcome Trust is that when Henry Wellcome died in 1936, he left not only his pharmaceutical company, but an enormous collection of objects. He had much more collecting power than the British Museum in his life, and he amassed more objects than the Louvre, which actually gave his trustees in the 1940s quite a headache as to what they should do with Henry Wellcome's collections. And it's actually largely dispersed around the world, although a very large fraction of it is deposited in the Science Museum. But to turn to the main topic, Graham's already raised, I think, an interesting question, which is, what am I doing talking about science? What is science doing in a meeting like this? So let's just look for a second at culture. And I picked up a couple of quotes about culture. This is a sort of fairly classical and boring definition of culture, which is to know the best that has been said and thought in the world. And I think that probably is a fairly general conception of culture. This one, I think, is perhaps more attractive, from Simone Weil. Culture is an instrument wielded by professors to manufacture professors, who, when their turn comes, will manufacture professors. And this, I think, is the quote that's probably most apposite to this meeting, which is about globalisation, a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. Many of us are striving to produce a blend of all the cultures which seem today to be in clash with one another. No culture can live if it attempts to be exclusive. And I think one can look around the world and see that this quote, although from Allahabad in 1936, actually is as timely as it ever was, and perhaps rather more timely if you look at the clashes between the cultures that are occurring around the world today. And perhaps it's unfair to say the clashes between the cultures, because actually the cultures have the potential to live in harmony. It's the people that claim to speak for them that I think cause the problems. A quote from the Foreign Office, which I rather delight in replaying from time to time, is that I was a member of the British Council Health Committee. And in their wisdom, the British Council decided about 10 years ago that they were going to wind up this committee. And so a young civil servant was dispatched from the Foreign Office to bring the glad tidings. And she stood in front of this committee and said that the Foreign Office didn't consider health to be a cultural good. And I think I beg to differ. So, is health a cultural good? Well, I think, firstly, health and well-being is a topic of universal interest, actually. You know, arguably, maintaining the well-being of societies is the most important thing that politicians could do. And in fact, if that was their mission statement, I think many of them might do a bit better. But I think the paradox is, and it relates to what Graham said, is that I think there is actually a deficit of cultural activities that are focused on health. And one of the things as I go around the world is that I'm very struck that health has the potential to be a key aspect of global diplomacy, but is actually an aspect of diplomacy that is largely neglected by diplomats. But I'll give you a rather concrete example. When the French and the British were looking to celebrate 100 years of the relationship between the UK and France, there was a real struggle about what on earth could we have as a topic, because we weren't getting on terribly well with Chirac at the time. And eventually they decided that the subject of the meeting would be cancer research. So there was a very grand dinner. I was rather pleased about this because I was the beneficiary of a nice dinner in the British ambassador's residence in Paris, which is I think the French are rather jealous that the British have this. It's allegedly better than the Champs-Élysées. It is a very, very spectacular building. But again, it emphasizes the fact that actually health is a common denominator. It's something that actually people, in spite of differences, can agree is something that is a common public and indeed cultural good. So I want now to turn straight into the question, which is what is the role of museums in health and culture? And I've pinched rather shamelessly a taxonomy from a paper by Martin Evans in, I think, an Australian journal, which is that he classified health as providing resources that help us to reflect upon ourselves, to express ourselves, to articulate ourselves, to develop ourselves. It provides a vocabulary for modern society in which we can criticize ourselves, and I'll come on to that, and it's a way of encountering ourselves in different ways. And I'm going to give examples now of each of these in the context of the Wellcome Collection. So, in terms of reflecting upon ourselves, the exhibitions you'll see this evening are upon themselves in the context of mental ill health. So these rather exquisite paintings, which you'll see these and more of this evening, are by a man called, an unknown artist essentially, called Josef Radler, who was a master porcelain painter. And you can immediately see when you see these images, they are absolutely exquisite. They're almost like oriental miniatures. And he painted these in an asylum in Vienna, and they are his encounters with himself, and they're also his reflections upon other inmates in the asylum in Vienna. And actually they were jolly near, well, they were thrown out. Someone encountered them in a skip many years ago and fortunately rescued them. And they are a unique set of pictures. And then alongside that, we have Bobby Baker's diary drawings. And actually, I think these are absolutely wonderful, and I think that every medical student actually should see these, because they take us inside the mind of Bobby Baker. And Bobby Baker is a performance artist. She's a formally trained artist who became mentally ill a few years ago, and throughout the whole of her illness, essentially kept a watercolour diary of what she was thinking. And there's just over 100 of these watercolours on display in the Wellcome collection at the moment, and a number of them are accompanied by these rather lovely little descriptions underneath. And I think that the descriptions are beautifully written and tell us what she's thinking about in her pictures. And this is a very, very powerful form of communication, and it shows you inside the mind of someone with illness in a way that very difficult to get at if you're just a young clinician trying to take a medical history. And in fact, she's jolly unlucky, because not only has she had this illness, but during the course of her diary keeping, she also had to have a knee replacement, and she developed breast cancer. So one sees the thoughts of someone undergoing a fairly routine, though uncomfortable, piece of surgery, and then all of the treatment for breast cancer. So a very powerful way of using a museum to actually show inside people's mind as they reflect upon themselves in the context of health and ill health. Now, I think that the second part of the taxonomy, which is articulating ourselves, this is something that I think everyone is familiar with, which is actually the depiction in art of the bodily condition in its various forms, everything from agony to ecstasy. And this is just a picture from the promotional advert for an exhibition that Ken Arnold, and I should acknowledge that our wonderful curators are Ken Arnold and James Pito, who work with a number of curators around the world to put on exhibitions. And before the Wellcome collection opened, which was about 3 years ago, we used to borrow a gallery at the Science Museum from time to time and put on exhibitions in there. And this was an exhibition at the Science Museum, I suppose about 5 or 6 years ago, on pain. And images of pain, of course, are fairly ubiquitous, and these are just a few examples, many of them, of course, from religious art, but also anatomy became a tool for expressing pain, and there's the rather powerful drawings of Vesalius, and then here is a later anatomical image. And this is an exhibition that we held recently at the Wellcome collection, which was called Sleeping and Dreaming. And again, here are some rather splendid sculptures of sleeping. I suppose the nearest thing is they're sort of donkeys on human bodies. And these rather lovely sleeping organisms were spread around the gallery. And again, this showed the way people thought about sleep and articulated it in various ways. And we had films, we had objects, we had science. And I think that what we try to do is mix fairly conventional objects that you'd see in a museum with contemporary works of art, with exhibits that might be considered more didactically, scientifically. And I should also say that we've had a very good collaboration with a museum with a slightly unprepossessing name of the Deutsches Hygiene Museum, which has the sort of history that you might be expected to be associated with that title, but which is now in Dresden one of the best science museums in Europe and indeed the world, I would say. Now, moving on to developing ourselves, I think that's moving the concepts of society from rather theological views of the heart as depicted on the left of this figure to a rather more contemporary depiction and the way we think about the heart shown on the right. And this was in fact the very first exhibition that we put on at the Wellcome collection, which was entitled The Heart. And the photograph is an extremely unusual photograph because this young woman is actually looking at her own heart. So just a matter of months before the exhibition, she had a heart transplant. And what she's looking at, pickled in a bottle, is the heart that was removed from her. So this is and you're also slightly shaking your heads. It wasn't quite as gruesome as it seemed. And there was, as you can imagine, a lot of enormous media interest in this and actually very good coverage. And she spoke very articulately about the experience of having a heart transplant. But it moves us from this very theological interpretation of what the heart is all about to a somewhat more biological explanation of what the heart is all about. and it humanizes it. We all have a heart. We rather take it for granted. We ignore it. It pumps away, hopefully ceaselessly, and when it does cease, well, we are no more. But this is an encounter with a heart of a rather different sort. And actually it reminds me of a colleague of mine when I was a professor of medicine at Hammersmith Hospital in West London. And she was a pathologist, and she had a heart and lung transplant. And I remember the somewhat surreal experience of her doing a grand pathological round on her own lungs. So again, encountering ourselves in a different way. And here again was an exhibition from about 6 months ago called War and Medicine. And this brought together the paradox that humans spend quite a lot of effort developing new and better ways to kill each other, and alongside that is the effort in medicine to put people back together again. And again, the paradox that many advances in medicine have come from war. And so blood transfusion was something that was developed very rapidly, mainly during the Second World War. Trauma surgery, the surgeons in Belfast, for example, became extremely expert in developing techniques to deal with people who had bullet wounds. This, you see here, is an example of some new technology from an organization at MIT and Harvard Medical School. And this is a simulator for treating people who've had perforating lung injuries. And again, in this exhibition, we mixed the very artistic, the very aesthetic, with, I have to say, the somewhat less aesthetic. And again, it produced a rather powerful exhibition. Now, criticizing ourselves, this is an object in one of our permanent galleries. It speaks for itself, really. I can't help the way I feel, is the title by a sculptor called John Isaac. It's as grotesque in real life as it is in the images. It stands about this high, and again you will see it this evening. But the vocabulary of medicine is a vocabulary that we now use in absolutely everyday life. It's the language of the diagnosis. So we know what the diagnosis of the problem with the MP's expenses is. And medical phrases have come to be used ubiquitously in common discourse. So we have diagnosis, we have prognosis, we have the treatment. Our everyday language is littered with words from medicine. And to move very firmly into the globalisation space, I think that one of the things that is very powerful where museums can play an important role is about showing how we encounter ourselves in different societies. And I don't know whether you were, when you were at the British Museum yesterday, you saw the Welcome Gallery there. There is a Welcome Gallery there. And that is where we can encounter people and how they conceive issues like living and dying in many different cultures. Because although from a biomedical point of view, our diseases are much the same regardless of which culture we live in, a myocardial infarction is a myocardial infarction whether you're in Papua New Guinea, New York, or KwaZulu-Natal. Nevertheless, the conceptions of it, how we think about it, indeed how we feel it, how we treat it, do vary somewhat. And there are very interesting cultural differences in the way that, for example, we take medicines. So in fact, Graham and I were both at the School of Pharmacy yesterday, and a French senior lecturer who works on delivering drug medicines to medicine pointed out that in France people much prefer taking their medicines rectally, whereas here we think it's rather a disgusting thing to do. So there are all sorts of important cultural differences that it's worth thinking about and understanding. And so I think that this is a very important global role that museums can play in thinking about health, well-being, illness in different cultural contexts. And this was an exhibition about encountering ourselves, which had a huge impact. And this was a series of photographs that we displayed, taken by a German photographer working with a partner who developed the narratives. And these were photographs of a series of about 30 people taken in the terminal stages of their lives when they were terminally ill, and then photographs taken after they had died. And so these were pairs of photographic images, very, very moving images, each accompanied by a short narrative, and fantastically well reviewed, very, very powerful exhibition. Lots of people came to see it. The visitors' books are extremely interesting because, of course, for the majority of us, fortunately, I think, we've lost the normal encounters with death that were part of the human condition until really the 20th century. The idea of children dying is now the most terrible thing. It always was terrible, but it was much more of the normal familial experience until the early part of the 20th century. And of course, still, in many parts of the world, it is still a normal experience to lose children to disease. And one of the things, the paradoxes, when we talk about population control and the need to do it, is that the demographic transition occurs between families having lots and lots of children and having just one or two, happens naturally when child mortality is reduced. So the most important thing you can do to achieve demographic control is actually to work on maternal and child health. Because if families start seeing that their children will expect to survive, then the pressure to have so many children actually changes very rapidly. So this exhibition, and this woman was 52 when she died, I think was a wonderful way of making people or offering the opportunity to encounter themselves in the context of their mortality. Now, I'll end very briefly by just saying something about museums and society more generally. So I've shown you, I think, how museums can play an important role in medicine and health, and I think there's absolutely no doubt that health is a cultural good. I think there is another taxonomy of what museums do. So I think museums are important in scholarship. I think we need to think how museums enter the digital age. We need to think of museums as social venues. And then finally, and I think very importantly, as places where things happen. So an exhibition on skeletons. The Museum of London has many thousands, I think 15 or 20,000 skeletons. Every skeleton that's dug up in a London excavation ends up in the Museum of London. And it's an interesting cultural exploration because skeletal remains from Aboriginal cultures. There are furious political battles about returning material to particularly New Zealand and Australia. We don't think or worry too much about skeletons in the UK, actually. There's something that, and we put on this exhibition, really there was no controversy at all. So here are 3 skeletons dug up in London, associated with a grant from the Wellcome Trust, where on the right you can see them being documented, and one could see a whole range of diseases from Roman times up to the 18th century from the skeletons. And that again got a lot of fascination. I think we're all familiar, and I think expect legitimately that museums increasingly, with things that go out to people, they will be online. But I think that there is no substitute for the physical object itself. I think anyone who has a sort of collecting urge knows the power of the object itself. And Henry Wellcome certainly knew this, and he was rather fascinated by celebrity as well. So you'll see Darwin's walking stick, you'll see Florence Nightingale's moccasins, you'll see a guillotine blade used in the French Revolution. So he really could, I think, understand very well the importance of the association, the real object itself. But I think that museums are also social venues. So I think it's about the democratization of culture, and we have the good fortune to have the resources, which means that we can have lots and lots of events. So we bring people in. It's not just looking at the objects, it's talking about the objects, it's discussing them. And those are just a few examples of the events that we've had. And to take you to something that's happening either next week or the week after, I think it's next week actually, they can be places that really bring people absolutely in conjunction directly with medicine as it happens. So this was some live surgery that was shown from Papworth Hospital a couple of years ago, where Francis Wells, the cardiac surgeon, did an operation There was an audience, the operation wasn't done at the Wellcome Collection, I'm pleased to say. It was done in an operating theatre at Papworth Hospital outside Cambridge. It was broadcast directly to the Wellcome Collection. There was an audience in our forum space who were asking the surgeon questions in real time, and he was sort of cutting away, he was answering questions to the audience. And if that sounds a bit weird, well, actually, you know, when I was a medical student, I was hanging on the retractor as people doing cardiac surgery and asking the questions there. Surgeons are used to talking as they work. But next week, as I say, I need to check for sure, it's Channel 4. We're actually broadcasting 4 operations live to the nation, in fact, to the world. And there will be an audience, again, in the Wellcome Collection who will have the opportunity to ask the surgeon patients, but these are being broadcast live in real time from 4 hospitals around the UK over 4 days. So that just gives you an idea of the role that I think that museums can play in medical culture, and I hope you see that there is an important niche where I think there's a lot of opportunities for more activity. Thank you for your attention.
Helen is a research associate at the International Centre for Cultural and Heritage Studies at Newcastle University. Her most recent publications, or upcoming, one of them is upcoming, called, the one that's coming up in 2009, or is it already out?
No, it's not yet.
Okay. Oral History, Learning Disability and Pedagogy.
Oh, that one is out, yes.
That one's out. And
I thought you were telling me then.
oh no, I was going to. Yes, that's true. There's one coming up soon, which is called To Label the Label: Learning Disability and Exhibiting Critical Proximity. In a book on representing disability. Earlier, she published an article called Post Pleasure in Feminist Media Studies. So,
Great, thank
over
you.
to you.
So I wanted to begin with an object which is currently being displayed at the Museum of Croydon in South London, and which was lent to the Museum of Croydon by Croydon resident Mabel Cooper. It's a literacy certificate which was awarded to Mabel by Croydon College in 2004, and it's displayed alongside her oral history. In her oral history, Mabel speaks about her experience of going to school and being told that she wasn't able to learn and that she needed to go home and not come back. She goes on to say that years later, after years being held in a long stay hospital, that she went to college and now her reading is, as she puts it, coming on. So as a way of considering museums and scale, I wanted to ask, how big is this object? How can it be sized? How can it be related to scaling terms such as micro, meso, macro, or specific and general? And how might it be related to forms of knowledge which operate on different scales? Is the certificate simply an example of how government policy towards people with learning disabilities has changed in the 21st century? Or can it be explained by terms such as capitalism or disableism? Or is there something in the specific object, Mabel Cooper's specific memory and experience, which is lost if it is translated into larger terms or thought about at a more abstract level? In this sense, all museums have the problem of scale, specifically how we order as a way of knowing. Considering museums in the context of globalisation and culture immediately brings scale to the fore. Scale might, seem a little bit like an abstract idea, but I think it is really crucial to the politics of museums. Scale allows us to see museums' implication in the politics of ordering, and scale might also allow us to see and develop some provisional sort of theoretical tactics for re-relating specific objects and experiences while keeping in mind how material inequalities are maintained. So perhaps one of the most widely referenced museum studies examples is the 19th century museum and the way they ordered specific objects to make visible the general theory of evolution. This form of ordering could be located as part of an epistemic shift, the beginnings of which Mary Poovey locates in the 18th century, as generating a form of knowledge through the long history of rarefication called modernity, as she calls it. An aspect of this rarefication was that the social, Poovey argues, became thinkable through abstraction. Things you can see became explainable by things you can't. So this meant that by the late 20th century, it was possible to account for who does the washing up by ideas of patriarchy, or liking classical music by being middle class. And over the last 10 years, the sciences and the social sciences have both been reconsidering how to think about specificity and how specificities might be interrelated. So, for example, in the sciences, the Human Genome Project has not in any way underpinned a straightforward linear sense of causality. Instead, there is increasing emphasis on complexity and interrelationship. So cancer cannot be said to be caused only by genetics, but by a multiplicity of factors, including diet, social network, well-being, and wealth. In the context of the social sciences, concern with relation between specificity and abstraction has led to what is sometimes called post-social theory. Post-social theory is basically quite sceptical about the way in which specific social experiences seem to be, in some traditional sociological explanation, to be both because of and explained by abstraction. So, for example, that being told you can't learn at school is both because of, say, capitalism or evolutionary biology and explained by capitalism and evolutionary biology. This post-social move is reflected in multiple attempts to tame globalisation and the scale on which that's been imagined, challenging the implication that it is a sort of smooth, homogeneous process. So alternatives to social reification have been suggested, specifically the tracing of associations, mobilities and networks. So, for example, both Bruno Latour and Doreen Massey argue that instead of simply evoking capitalism and globalisation, we should rather ask, where is globalisation, capitalism, or disableism, or literacy for that matter, made up? Through which networks, in which buildings, through which documents, pieces of paper, emails, etc. So to return to museums, it's possible to detect specific problems with scale in the sector. And I want to use, for a moment, Barbara Kirsten Black-Gimblett's reading of the UNESCO Masterpieces of Oral and Tangible Heritage lists, and suggest that in considering globalisation and culture in the context of the UNESCO list, scale is highly significant. So this masterpieces list implies that it is a homogenising process of globalisation which threatens culture as specificity, and that culture as specificity, which in the form of particular expressions, must be preserved. In this context, such cultural specificity seems to be, however, only preservable by becoming codified through the metacultural in the form of abstract principles and ordering devices such as lists, and structured through principles based on appeals to universal humanity. As such, globalisation and culture in the context list operate at a different scale, one macro and the other micro. Yet preservation itself requires a generalising movement through which judgments of quality can rescale specific cultural expressions as themselves standing in for wider expressions of humanity. In a sense, then, the masterpieces are treated as too specific, too unique, too original, unconnected, and without, outside the context of wider conditions of possibility, but in a sense also as too general, as erasing specificity and universalising ownership of them. In contrast, at the Museum of Croydon, it's possible to detect a kind of post-social mood. The Museum of Croydon display does not seek to tell one story of Croydon. Instead, hundreds of different stories are evoked, and people's specific experiences are used to tell all kind of wider stories. As you can see on this label here, the explanation is actually located quite low down the interpretive hierarchy, and therefore explanation of Mabel's specific story goes off in one direction, all the other stories go off in multiple different directions. So in a sense, the connection between the people in the display is not at the level of unifying abstraction, so one meta-history of Croydon, but in a way through simply being in Croydon and being in the display. So while the networks and connections which make these memories are partially traced, no interconnection between individuals are made. So in a way, while the Museum of Croydon approach is not in any way being too general and too abstract, there is a danger that this approach is too specific. The danger of too much specificity without connection is linked to a criticism often made of post-social theory, specifically what is known as actor-network theory, and that is that because of loss of abstraction, so the loss of being able to name causal forces that say cause inequality, that politics itself is also lost. Bruno Latour, who argues in defence of actor-network theory and his work, the work that he advocates of tracing associations, that, and this is the quote, "It does not require enormous skill or political acumen to realise that you have to fight against a force that is invisible, untraceable and total. You'll be powerless and roundly defeated. and that localising the global, he argues, and that includes abstraction, by breaking down and identifying the skein of weak ties and surprising connections that make up our social worlds, is the only way to begin to contemplate any kind of fight. So I want to hang on to this idea that politics, whether of research, of display, or of museum practice, is fundamentally affected by how you connect specificities and generalities, all local and global, as the talk puts it. So I just want to suggest some sort of theoretical tactics which might be useful in our day's work together, but I think are also potentially interesting and useful for museum practice generally. So from Doreen Massey, the idea of coevalness. Massey suggests that we need to think about the world in terms of all of us here on the planet together now. So that sense of connection in the present. And that specific places should be understood as made up of global interconnection, what she refers to as a global sense of place. From Latour, maybe the idea of tracing associations and networks, so both localising the global by thinking about where big forces such as capitalism are made up, which buildings, which pieces of paper, but also globalising the local by tracing connections which make up the specific. And finally, linking the sciences and the social sciences, the idea of complexity, that straight linear causality is difficult to trace, and the specific and the general are not necessarily directly connected. So if museums do play a role in the globalisation of culture, there is one which is likely to be highly contingent and on multiple other factors, and which will work in non-consistent ways. So I focus here on how museums order, but of course scale is also an issue for how we order museums, how we link specific museum practices to their effects. It might be that being aware of the analytic movements that make up scale might help us understand what's at stake in the analysis that we're going to do over the next few days. So in conclusion, and after all that, all those kind of specific connections I've been trying to make, I suppose I could just have generalised by saying size matters.
Thanks very much. I can see where she is, Valentina. Thank you. Valentina Vadi is completing her PhD at in the law department of the European University Institute in Florence. She studied earlier in. Are you okay, Jim? Yeah. In both Florence and in Oxford. She's also the editor of the European Journal of Legal Studies, and her subject is cultural heritage, in particular in relation to underwater heritage. That's what she's going to speak to us about today.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be here, and I feel very honored to participate to this extremely interesting initiative. This morning I'm going to focus on a very specific topic, which is underwater cultural heritage and the role that museums may play in the preservation of underwater cultural heritage. So I think that it's a very particularly appropriate topic for this session. But before beginning, we may just have a look at the program of this presentation. First, I will define underwater cultural heritage so that this concept is clearly defined. Then I will just focus on what I call the pirate's dilemma, just to see what are the problems related to the conservation and preservation of underwater cultural heritage. Then I will briefly scrutinize the international legal framework and I will critically assess this legal framework. And then I will propose this sort of innovative solution, or at least a way of reconciling the different interests at stake, which is represented by museums. And then I will offer some preliminary conclusions. When we talk about underwater cultural heritage, we immediately think about ships, shipwrecks. But it's not just shipwrecks. It's a much broader concept, in a sense that it includes sites, structures, also objects, and so it's a much broader idea. Why do we need to protect underwater cultural heritage? There are three main reasons. First of all, because of its archaeological and historical value. It's like having access to a time capsule, in a sense that while land archaeology is stratified, so it's very difficult to have the full picture of a certain period of time, because there are connections with other stratifications of different ages. With underwater cultural heritage, I mean, having access to a shipwreck is like having access to a certain period of time or a certain date, because everything is in context. So, and then, of course, a second reason to protect underwater cultural heritage is its cosmopolitan character, because by nature these ships were traveling around the oceans, and so they own this cosmopolitan character. And then, finally, and perhaps most importantly, because of the spiritual value associated with these remains, because, of course, shipwrecks may be associated to tombs, collective burials, and sometimes finding these shipwrecks is like solving a historical puzzle, the disappearance of many people. Well, now, what are the dangers? If we don't protect underwater cultural heritage, what are the perils against which we have to fight? First of all, there are natural events. So let's think about tsunami or even meteorological conditions and so on. And then there is the human problem given by looters, because of course there is always the temptation to get these archaeological objects and to sell them in international markets. And then there is a third problem, and here I put this equation, salvage pirates, because salvage is a maritime concept by which, if there is a ship in peril at sea, and somebody is so nice to help this ship, he is entitled to claim a reward. And this reward is usually very large, just to promote solidarity. Why I'm talking about salvage, which seems to be a very nice concept here, talking about ancient shipwrecks. The problem is that Admiralty Court, as they didn't have a specific rule on the recovery of ancient shipwrecks, they adopted, by analogy, the concept of salvage to the recovery of these ancient shipwrecks. So if a person finds an ancient shipwreck at sea and recovers the artifacts, he is entitled to claim an award, which is part of the objects. So these objects may be sold at Christie's in Amsterdam or even in London. And the problem is that from a cultural perspective, these objects are lost forever. So that's why some authors really condemn salvage as a criminal activity, and whilst in other countries this is not criminal at all. But now let's just scrutinize some cases. What kind of issues may arise when you find a shipwreck at sea? This is a very recent discovery. There was an Italian company which was connecting a town in Italy with Algeria, just building a pipeline, and they discovered a shipwreck of this French war vessel, which sank in 1917. And immediately the company announced that they will reroute the pipeline, and so just not to destroy the ship and so on. And France immediately requested Italy to declare this zone as a sort of maritime sanctuary, because a lot of people died in that circumstance. With regard to another ship, this is a British ship, which again sank in the Mediterranean Sea. It was a dramatic event because this was not a warship, but it was a passenger ship. So basically, it was attacked by a German submarine, which didn't follow the maritime routes, which provided for not attacking passengers' vessels. So basically, they didn't even fire a blow just to inform the passengers to abandon the ship. So they immediately attacked, and so after 5 minutes the ship was sunk. So after so many years, after almost 90 years, we have found this ship. Well, a British salvor found the ship, and they have sold the artifacts at an auction. So we have lost this sort of many of these cultural objects. And it's important to stress that it's not, I mean, when you think about shipwrecks, you may think about war vessels, military people, but it's not the case. These were very normal people. And in this picture, you see that there was a top model of the time, because she was in the ship, and she was also the model for the Wings of Desire, which appears in the Rolls-Royce. So you see, very normal people might be there. And so you have access to a certain capsule of time. Then in another case, this was exactly the same commander, the same German commander, sank more than 150 ships in the Mediterranean. So I mean, he was just sinking everything, attacking everything. So and here the problem was that, I mean, it was a passenger ship again, and it was transporting Italian immigrants from Naples to New York. So basically, there were women, children, and more than 700 people died in these occasions. So why an American salvo is interested in this ship? Because if it was transporting immigrants, they were poor people by definition. But indeed, there were many barrels of gold, so we don't really know the owner of this gold. We are thinking about a possible transfer of gold from a bank to another. The Italian state is thinking maybe it belonged to Bank of Italy. We really don't know, because we lack historical information, but in any case there is this US company which is claiming the ownership of this ship, because of course it sank more than 90 years ago, and so of course there is a problem of ownership, who owns what, and how to and then a final case that I would like to mention here, and I think that it may link this session to the next one, which is dealing with difficult heritage. I'm talking about the so-called Rommel's treasure. Of course, you know that Northern Africa was invaded by German troops. They set up labor camps in Tunisia, and they also stole a lot of gold and cultural artifacts from the Jewish community. When they were transporting all this treasure towards the continent, the ship sank because it was shared by their allies. And now the problem is that we found the ship just almost 2 years ago, and it was a British researcher who located this ship, which is at less than 1 nautical mile from Bastia in Corsica. So now we have this ship, which is located in the territorial sea of France. So it's in its territory. And then we have a British researcher who, according to French law, would be entitled to half of this recovery. But then the ship was a German ship, so it's a German military vessel. So according to established rules, military vessels belong to the state, the flag state. And according to German law, of course, the Jewish community would be entitled to claim the treasure, because there is an act which accords them, of course, the right to have all these things restituted. So we still don't know how these very complex issues will be dealt with, because as you can understand, it's really complicated. Now, with regard to the legal framework, it's extremely complicated. There are conventions. The problem is that they are extremely vague. There is an excellent convention which has come into force just a few months ago, which is the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage. This convention is extremely interesting because it provides for in situ preservation of underwater cultural heritage. So it provides for a sort of archaeological friendly approach, and it also provides that salvage may be allowed, but only on non-commercial terms. So as far as we protect these cultural goods and we don't sell them as commercial objects, salvage may be contemplated as, giving a certain reward to the private actor who finds the ship, but objects shouldn't be sold. Of course, as you may imagine, a lot of countries have not ratified the convention, and we still don't know if they will. To date, I just controlled a few days ago before coming here, there were 25 parties. But there has been an increased process of ratification, so we really don't know how it will go on. And then, with regard to summarizing the complex debate, of course, here you see the clash of interest between private actors and public actors. On the one hand, there is a public interest to see the exhibitions of these artifacts, to have public access to these cultural goods. On the other hand, you see the public interest to find these treasures and to recover money from this, from their expertise and from their for their activity. And so the question of my presentation is whether we can find a way to reconcile these different interests, and if we may use or we may consider museums as a way to, for reconciling these different interests. We see that the convention, the UNESCO convention, proposes in situ preservation, and this may be particularly suitable in remote areas like Pianosa, which is a small island in the midst of the Mediterranean, which used to be a jail. So for something like 100 years, this was a jail for extremely dangerous criminals and so on. Only in the last decade, it has been open to the public. So the jail has been eliminated. I mean, well, if you go there, you see the buildings. And I think that in this specific circumstance, in situ preservation might be wonderful. I mean, organizing scuba diving activities might be extremely particularly appropriate. But of course, museums may complement this approach, because nowadays there are more than 150 museums, and this may be a useful, a very appropriate way to reconcile different interests, because of course museums may contribute to the economic, social and cultural development of the host state, and of course they may overcome the dilemma between ownership and management, because it doesn't matter who really owns the underwater cultural heritage, but if we organize exhibitions and we create loans among museums and so on, everybody can enjoy this cultural, can visit this and see these cultural objects. And then, of course, the salvors, those who find these shipwrecks at sea, they may be entitled to get revenues coming from these exhibitions. So I don't see this, I mean, I think that this might be a way to create a sort of compatibility between the different interests at stake. And here I just put two pictures of the Greenwich Museum, which is just the maritime museums located in Greenwich, which is extraordinary. And now I think that I don't have the time to talk about this cultural diplomacy, so yeah. I think that I may reach.
I think we're going to be fairly flexible, so if you want to take us.
Okay, that would be great. That would be great.
Is that all right? Because I can't resist the picture.
Yeah. Okay. This is about looted art, how to solve this dilemma of the original owners. For instance, if you think about the people who died in ancient shipwrecks, I mean, you think, okay, it's extremely difficult to find the heirs, or it's not. It's not. When I was preparing this research, I was having lunch with a colleague of mine, and he told me that his grandfather actually died during one of these shipwrecks. So, I mean, it was amazing just to look at the list of the people who were in these ships, just to find the name of his ancestors. So it's not impossible. And in any case, I think that this issue is very much related to the current debate on looted art. How do we deal with this art which was stolen and, for instance, belonged to Jewish community or colonial heritage and so on and so forth? Now, I just wanted to mention the fact that cultural diplomacy may play a role, and in this cultural diplomacy concept, of course, museums are leading actors. Here we see two pictures, and the first one is the Venus of Cyrene. Cyrene is located in Libya, and this is a nice example of cultural diplomacy, intense cultural diplomacy, because basically Italy has not a long history of colonialism, because we were not a colonial power. But for just a very short period, we had Libya was our colony, and Italian troops arrived there and discovered this beautiful Venus, the Venus of Cyrene, and immediately brought it to Rome as a colonial prize. And now, I mean, there was, of course, the request by Libya to obtain this material back. And there was a huge negotiation. Indeed, the Italian government agreed to restitute this beautiful Venus. There was a case because a non-governmental organization challenged this decision because they said, look, this is a Roman statue. So, I mean, wherever it was found, it's a Roman statue, so it belongs to Rome. And, of course, the judges decided that it didn't belong to Rome. And so it had to be restituted to Libya. Of course, in a broader terms, it may seem that we are good guys, but it was not really the case. In a sense, of course, there were political considerations because we have a huge immigration, and so there was a sort of, okay, we give you this cultural good, but in exchange, you will keep immigrants in the coast. I mean, you will implement more controls and so on. So there was it was sort of really diplomatic negotiation, and then the second picture shows a beautiful vase which was held by the Metropolitan by the Met in New York. And here the museum played a very nice role because there was this debate as the vase was looted in Etruscan tombs. There was this debate about restitution because, of course, Italy asked for the restitution of this vase, which was looted. And the museum was really extremely kind to restitute it. And so nowadays there are several agreements between Italy and the US, but also between Italy and some museums in the US for the restitutions of looted art. So basically, I think this is a very interesting role that museums may play in creating a sort of dialogue among nations. And of course, this is not just a unilateral act, but of course there are agreements among Italy and this museum to create exhibitions of other cultural artifacts or loans and so on. So there is an extremely good cooperation among the different actors. And then the last case, I don't know if I have time. I mean, it's just, okay. This is an extremely interesting case because this portrait was painted by Klimt. It's the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. Adele Bloch-Bauer was an Austrian. She was married to a very wealthy man. And the problem was that when she died, she really wanted to give this painting. It was a series of paintings. I'm showing this one because this has a particular history. So she asked her husband to give these paintings to the national museums after her death. The problem was that it was not compulsory in a sense that, of course, at her death, the husband was the heir. So, I mean, of course, he agreed to give this to the museums, but it was not compulsory. So she died, and then he inherited everything. And the problem was that as he was Jewish, he was persecuted, and so all his property were expropriated, confiscated by the state. So basically, he died during the Second World War almost without nothing. But he wrote a will, and in this will he gave almost everything to his nephews. And well, about his nephews, they were able to escape, and so Maria Bloch, who married Mr. Altmann, they were able to escape from Austria because also her husband was Jewish, so they gave everything just to escape. And so after many years, they tried to enforce the will of their uncle because their uncle just wrote his will, and in this will it was clear-cut that everything should belong to them. So Austria claimed that everything was in museums, so there was public accessibility, so they didn't really care about even replying to these letters and so on. Finally, the things started moving in the past decade because there was a decision in the US which entitled these nephews to claim this complex, all these things. And finally, we got a decision 2 years ago, and so they got the paintings back. and so there was this restitution by Austria to this couple. These paintings were in public exhibitions for a few months, but then they were sold at public auction. And this painting was bought by a millionaire, Loder, which has set up an extremely interesting museum in New York, the Neue Gallery, which is made up by things bought by Jewish refugees, made up by these specific cultural objects. And so this is still on public display. Unfortunately, the other paintings were bought by other private parties and so. But I think that this is a very interesting case because it shows that restitution is an important issue, especially as a way to reparate historical wrongs. And then it may be coupled by public accessibility as well, because of course I think that Uta wrote a very interesting thesis on this issue, on how to raise public funds also to buy these cultural objects and so on. So it's not impossible to find a way to restitute these goods and also to have public accessibility. So it's not impossible to find ways to deal with this. So my conclusions is that museums can be global actors, can adopt also very nice standards of ethics, and of course museums may contribute to the economic, social and cultural developments of the host state. And they also may contribute to the peaceful relations among nations. So I think that in this with all these problematic legal issues, if we don't stop focusing exactly on the legal issues and we try to develop a dialogue among the different actors, museums may be the catalyst for an increased dialogue and goodwill cooperation among the different actors. Thank you for your attention.
Positive resolution, but there's more to be said. So I'd like to invite now Fredrik Thomasson to give the third paper in this section. Fredrik's higher education has crossed a number of fields. Your MA you studied Arabic and political science. Your MA was in humanitarian assistance, and your PhD is in again the European University Institute in Florence in the Department of History and Civilization. And he is also a project manager and consultant in developmental work. Or has been. Was in the past. Thank you very much.
How do I get out of here? Let's see.
You'll find it.
So, I also want to, like Valentina, want to thanks for being invited and so on, but we might do that in the end. So let's go to the issue here. I'm going to talk about a single stone, basically. This is what my paper is about. And I try not to resume the paper, as I hope some of you have read it. This stone, this is the first published copy of it. I'll show you the next picture. So, this stone is now in the basement of the British Museum, and I think we're basically on the same level here. So it's just on the other block. We could bore our ways through like bank robbers. This gallery is closed. The three pictures. This is the first real copy. This was an English. It was actually the chaplain at the Constantinople embassy that made a copy in 1722. The first publication. Here is the actual stone. It's actually pretty big. And to make a measure, this is my son standing beside it. You can't go and see it because this gallery has been closed for quite some time, so you have to make a special appointment to go down and see it. And on the left-hand side, you see there's a little explanation of the stone. But the explanation basically tells us what it was used for in antiquity. It's a funerary monument. I often have the impression that when we talk about museums, we talk about objects, it gets a little bit rarefied. So I will start with a map. These are actually the actual geographical locations which I talk about in my paper. The stone here, the ancient name is Segal. Today it's a very small coastal village in Turkey at the Dardanelles. It's just on the coast. The village is now called Yenişehir. And there's nothing much there. It's very close to Troy. And of course, we have the museums in Paris and London, but we'll talk about that later. So, the stone was dedicated and put up at around 550 before Common Era, as we usually say today. And then we have this little timeline here. Then we have almost 2,200 years of nothing. We don't know what happened. And then the stone was first discovered by Westerners. The first news we have about it is from 1718. Then it was published, and if you read the paper, you could see that this stone sort of became very interesting in European minds in the late 18th century. And it was actually this was the first object that Lord Elgin acquired in his great collection. Before he took down the Parthenon sculptures, before he took down the Caryatid, it was actually the first thing he took. If you want to take it, took, plunder, loot, remove. I mean, it's difficult to use these words. And he actually took it on his way to Constantinople in 1799. But as I state in the paper, it was difficult to take, because this stone had taken on another significance. It was used by the local populations as a kind of, now we usually call it a talisman. The stone was actually lying in front of a little church, a little chapel. It's very tiny, it's just a chapel. And the local population used it for healing, especially you had malaria in the area. So people were rolled over it, while the local priests were reading pieces out of the Bible and so on and so forth. So during 70, almost 80 years, people tried to take it, but they did not manage. And eventually, it was taken, but only by using military force. And this is, I want to connect it like a little bit to the larger history up here. I mean, the French invaded Egypt in 1798, which is supposed to be the first great moment of European, Eastern or Middle Eastern colonialism. And then the British came a couple of years later. And we can say, can we connect this actual happening to a larger history? I think we can, because there wouldn't have been any military in the Eastern Mediterranean if we hadn't the wars. The British soldier that accompanied Elgin and managed to take the stone, there was probably violent resistance. There had been violent resistance before. And we have witnesses that are saying the population were extremely averse to the removal of the stone. So I think the stone as an object tells us different stories. It tells us the ancient Greek story. It tells us the story about how it was used by the local populations. It tells us also the story of early European, I don't know, do we want to call it colonialism? By expansion in the Eastern Mediterranean. It arrived in London in 1800 or 1801, we don't know. I mean, basically at the same time as the Rosetta Stone that we also have still in the British Museum. Then something else happened. The Parthenon sculptures got put up in these huge galleries, and the inscriptions became less and less important. They were put down in the basement. And like in the end of the 19th century, the stone disappears from the British Museum records, basically. I mean, we can still see it. It's still part of the exhibition, but it goes down in the basement, and art has been privileged in the collections. So, very briefly, these will be my conclusions of my little paper. So, the removal of artifacts, we'll call it an artifact, this stone, the object, was more often resisted than usually given account for. There are a few testimonies from Athens, but when you start looking at the sources, you start reading the diaries of people. I was actually at the British Museum yesterday, no, the British Library yesterday to look at one of these diaries of a guy called John Cam Hobhouse. He was a friend of Byron, and they traveled together in Greece in 1809 and 1810. And I just checked the quotations in some other thing I'm writing. And I mean, they actually talk about these things, but it hasn't really been published and acknowledged. But if you read all the travel accounts, and I think I read most of them from, let's say, 1750 to 1800, you have a fair amount of these testimonies of how the local populations view their own objects. And I mean, I've been concentrating on the ancient Greek objects. So there were stones, there were coins, there were pieces of sculptures, there were inscriptions. This is usually not given account for in the history of these objects. So, and I think the large part of this is the so-called superstition fact. These were used for local superstitions. They were part of Christian traditions, but the Greek church has been very reluctant to recognize it because its superstition is not really part of Orthodox Christianity. So there's many reasons for not even the Greek picking up these materials, because it picked up most of the other things, but the superstition angle, the magic angle, has not really been picked up. This also tells us that we have very different criteria for different kinds of objects. I mean, I don't know if you read the paper, there is a small quotation from he's actually the keeper, Dyfrey Williams, he's the keeper of the Greek and Roman collections, sort of the colleague of Jonathan King that we met yesterday, that basically says that, well, these people resisted it, but it was on the grounds of superstition, so it's not important. Could you say that about so-called Aboriginal objects? I don't think so. Visual sources, I have a few pictures in my paper. If we have a couple of minutes, I'll show you the picture coming afterwards. But I think we can also use visual sources in trying to see how the perceptions of these objects change. I'll have an example which is pretty clear afterwards. What is also pretty clear in the paper that we have this restitution debate today, and we think we are new, or we think we have new ideas or whatever, but I would say that all positions in the restitution debate today were already present at 1800. I mean, I would say there's nothing new under the sun, but we are very much repeating arguments already made, and sometimes unconsciously. So it might be an idea to start and go a little bit backwards to track this debate. There's a new book that came out last year which actually tracks it back to Roman times, Art as Plunder, which basically charts this discussion all the way to Cicero. There was critique, very little from France and Britain, almost none, until Byron's famous critique. But there were instances of critique. I'm Swedish, so I picked up Swedish sources. I know there's something in Austria. There was critique, and it was printed and it was discussed. But it's also one of these things we have to pick up maybe a little bit from history. And back to the object. So, does the knowledge of this repeated resistance, does it change our perception of this actual object? Does it make it more valuable? Does it make it more interesting? Can we use it for something else? Okay, I'll just show you the picture before I come to the last slide. This is what is in the paper. This is the whole image. It's from this very important book, which is called Important Book Books. There are like 4 big volumes of them. I actually saw one of them is actually in this Enlightenment Gallery in the British Museum. So one of the few books exhibited in the glass cases. So it's considered important. This is the detail there. This is a picture that was drawn in 1752, probably 1751, 1752. This is how one of these fears were communicated to the Western market, how antiquities were destroyed. I mean, it's pretty obvious that this is actually a inscribed marble. It says AT, and then we don't know, it's maybe an H, it's maybe from an H. So, and then we have had discussions was actually the Arabic writing means, and there has been different interpretations. It might be an Allah actually, but written by someone who doesn't really know Arabic, who's just copied the signs. Another thing which is in the British Museum, but not in the cellar, is her. This is a picture from the same book. It's also from around 1750. And here's actually James Stewart who made the drawing. He's put himself a little self-portrait down here. And this picture is of the so-called Edicteum, which is a part Pandroseum. This is the little porch, which is in Athens now, which is part of a fairly big temple complex. The caption is quite interesting. These people actually have names. And we know that this is the daughter of the Distar, one of the Agas, one of the actual governors, because this was a Turkish military fortress, the Acropolis. And he talks about these two guys were sent out by the Brits, by Stewart and Reverett, these two people that actually made this book, to dig to see about the foundations. And we had these people watching, because these were actually Janissaries, soldiers put there to watch them, so they didn't take anything away. So there's an interesting story behind this. Then we have a picture which is 50 years later. This is made by a British traveller who was called Edward Dodwell. It was only published in the 20s, but the drawing was made in 1804. Here we have a completely different scene. She's already away. Has been put up by a brick pylon. She was probably on her way to the British Museum at that time. This is also what I said before about the visual sources. I mean, it's very easy to over-interpret visual sources. But on the other hand, we also over-interpret written sources. So we don't have any people anymore here. We have a dancing band. The caption says, this is a Turkish dancing band that performs at the Acropolis every afternoon. One of the characters is gone. No people. There's a changed perception. This has become museal. It was not the perception of 50 years before. But we should also know that the actual picture that we saw before is the first real serious antiquarian pictures from Athens. This Antiquities of Athens books had a huge impact. But here, this is only 50 years later, 52 years later, everything has changed. So, I only read the title of the meeting, which is London Debates. So I just want to bring up a few points actually for debates. I don't want to be polemical, but I often, as I said in the beginning, I often have the impression that there is this, sometimes when we talk about museum, because in my view, I don't know if it's a majority view, but museums are a repository for objects. This is their base function. There we can discuss digital and all these things, but the museum as a storehouse for objects doesn't seem to go away. So when we talk about museums, I think it can be good to talk about objects, the actual things sometimes. The next word in the title is globalisation. I think that, and this is also mentioned in many of the papers, I mean, museums since their foundation have been globalized. If we say that the modern museum was created somewhere in the 18th century, it's very much a function of the enlargement or of the view of the world. I mean, they have, to a certain extent, very much been the place where objects from all over the world were brought in. It's nothing new. So do we want to put that into history? And that's the next thing. History and time, very large concepts. And if you want to ask me to explain them, I won't, because I don't know how to. But they often vanish. We talk about other things. And I think that history, I'm supposed to be a historian, I don't know, maybe. But when we always strive to make the museum contemporary, or modern, or accountable, or interesting, we really have to think about who we think we are serving, or who we're talking for. Because we always put ourselves in somebody else's position and say we do this and that for she and he. Difficult at times. And this is also the next point. I'm not talking about the Shahbaz exhibition here. I'm actually not talking about the transient exhibitions, but I'm talking about the permanent exhibitions. And they have pretty long shelf life. We discussed this yesterday. I mean, we said some of them are 50 years old, and some of them are maybe even 100 years old. Museums have fairly long cycles of change in their permanent exhibitions. So when we do something now, it might be there for 50 years. I think this is a little bit a lesson to be learned when thinking about the permanent exhibitions. I think maybe the time perspective, if we have a short time perspective backwards, we will also lose some kind of time perspective forwards, I don't know. And the last thing, again, the stone. Do we want to bring it up? Is it important? Should we start thinking about other Greek antiquities? I mean, it's 2008, 2,600 years old. We know little of its history. We know like for a couple of hundred years how does it change the perception of this particular object? And by doing that, do we talk for someone else? Do we talk for these inhabitants? There's no Greek-speaking population left in this area, of course. They were all kicked out, or I mean, there was this great population exchange with Turkey and Greece in the 1920s. So if we talk about restitution claims, which I try to avoid, there is no one to ask it back. Where should it go? Should it go to the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, which is a fantastic museum, where they have a lot of the actual marbles from the Troad, which were not taken by other people? Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Obviously, a lot of issues were raised which will be running throughout our discussion. I quite like the fact that in a way we came back to an object and promoter of health at the end of the discussion as well as at the beginning. But I'd like to open it to the floor. Yeah, Graham?
Could I ask Fredrik a question?
Please.
I assume that the inscription has been translated. Mm-hmm. You could argue if the inscription said trespassers will be prosecuted, we might be very interested. But if it had some philosophical point to it, or related, I hadn't seen your paper in advance, I don't know. Does the value change as an object, historical or social or cultural, depending upon what the object's role was in its real life?
Well, I would say so. Do you want me to read actually what it says? I can read the inscription on the stone. It's very brief. So this is Phanodikos. It's the actual guy that dedicated it, and it says, "I am of Phanodikos." And it's actually the stone itself speaking, which is very common in early Greek monuments. It's like, "I am the stone. I am of Phanodikos, son of Hermocrates. I gave a mixing bowl, support and a strainer for the Prytaneum." The Prytaneum is kind of a town hall where you met and had banquets. "To the Prytaneum, to the citizens of Segal as a memorial. If I should in any way suffer," and I again is a stone, "if I should any way suffer, care for me, citizens of Segaeon, and Isopos and his brothers made me." It's a funerary inscription.
It changes it, yeah.
Yes.
Would anyone else like to respond from this side? Or?
Can I make a general comment about the last two talks? Because actually, there isn't anything necessarily hugely material different between an object that's underwater or underground, actually. I mean, the difference being about underwater is that you can argue about it's less accessible, although actually if it's underground it's less accessible, and you can argue about who owns the geographical territory. But the common denominator of the two talks is actually slippery slopes. And John Harris, talking about slippery slopes, says that you can deal with slippery slopes in two ways. You can use crampons or you can use skis. And I'm of the crampon school. And it seems to me that we then get into the discussion about restitution, which is never ending. And it seems to me that you deal with the slippery slope there by dealing with, if there is a clear, tangible link to someone who is alive now, and that applies to almost all of the stuff that the Nazis dealt with during the last war, the argument is very straightforward. And so the Austrian case, I thought the Austrians behaved extremely badly. But frankly, when it's a shipwreck from the 18th century, which has 1 million pieces of porcelain, well, actually, I'm delighted to have one of those on one of my shelves at home. And I think that the argument actually is about the boundaries of that. But when one goes a very long back, I'm afraid I'm entirely with Neil McGregor on the Elgin marbles and everything else in the British Museum.
Did I take a stand on restitution?
You didn't. No, you didn't. You didn't.
Yeah, I think that this is a very good point. I just wanted to mention the debate about looted art because, for instance, in the case of the German warship which sank close to Bastia, that is an issue of restitution to my eyes because it's a very recent fact, and I mean, and these objects wouldn't even be protected by the UNESCO Convention because the UNESCO Convention just protects things which are more than 100 years old. So that is one of the gap of the convention. So if we consider them as archaeological objects, they might be protected according to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But the problem with these objects is that according to the new convention, they are not protected. And I mean, in that specific case, I think that, I mean, an issue of restitution is there. I mean, I think that I mean, of course, there might be argument against it, but that's why I really wanted to clarify what are the most recent trends. And indeed, the case of Adele Bloch-Bauer just took place in 2006, notwithstanding the fact that since the 50s, Maria Altman attempted to make the case, but it was not possible to have because she didn't even get replies. So her lawyers based in Austria just sent a lot of letters. So I think that it's...
But do you accept the point that it is that very clear link that can be established between someone living today and someone associated with the remain, be it underwater or above ground, actually?
Well, it really depends. I mean, we can't really have absolute standards because, of course, one thing is about talking about the Spanish Armada warships. I mean, they sank centuries ago, and there Spain has a clear claim because some of them really belong to the state. So, with regard to vessels, which once belonged to the state, their rule is quite clear-cut in a sense that it still belongs to the state. So, warships, for instance, British warships or U.S. warships, they all belong to the state. The things become more complicated when you are dealing with commercial ships or ships which once belonged to private owners. According to salvage law, your issue is a nice one because it needs to be clarified. If there is a ship and there is an admiralty court proceedings according to which a salvor attempts to get the award, the salvage awards, in the UK, 1 year has to pass just to give the eventual owners the possibility to counteract and to say, okay, we are the heirs and we want to, I mean, that ship was not abandoned at sea and so we are the owners and so you have to deal with us as well. So the award, of course, will be reduced somehow. So in the UK it works in this way. In the US, other rules apply, other maritime rules apply. So there is not a solution for every single, there are rules and also interacting norms. So, but you can't really have an absolute answer.
I've got lots of other people with their hands up, so I'm going to try and move it on a little bit. Tilly, next.
Yes, first of all, I want to thank you for a really extraordinarily interesting panel. Every lecture was really fascinating and very, very different. And I just want to give some associative feedback. Not so much on the legal questions, these are very, very difficult, but I see a certain similarity between the ship issue and between the steel issue. And I would like to see exhibitions that you might ask, why should an accidental moment in history that a ship sank and you find it, adventurers are looking for gold and values and they suddenly find it. Why should it stay together? You know, it was meant. There is a shipwright is a moment in history where people for 1 week or for 3 months, depending on the type of the ship, put together and then they go apart. But since this accidental moment happened, I think it's fascinating to leave it together, just for that reason, for no other reason. And to exhibit under a social history perspective this incidental moment in history. And the same came to my head with the steel. The interest, you can use such a steel with the inscription to illustrate an historical moment of the time when it was found. But what you presented, the history of the item itself is so fascinating that I would make an exhibition on that history, not so much on the content of the steel, but on the history. And I think that's a universal notion now, and it's very popular in Germany, to focus on the question how the various artifacts reached the museums. They were lootings, but it's not that clear. The type of archaeological looting had some legal base. It wasn't steal. It wasn't in the sense stealing like we would say things are stolen today. But the fact that some companies were interested in the archaeological remains raise an interest in the countries itself. So it's a process that influences each other. And German museums now give that story to the visitors. If you get an audio guide, you get the story. And I think focus on exhibitions that tell these stories will be very, very fascinating. And a third item that a third idea that came to my head while working in the museum and trying to propose exhibitions in the global sense, we need loans, and loans you don't get from money. Museums can get money. As you indicated, they could play an active role in solving legal conflicts and putting things together. I'm afraid they can't do that anymore. They don't have the money to do that. And even and if things are split apart and go all over the world, if you want to reconstruct this historical moment of a ship going from A to B, and you want to take things on loan, you will never get it back. So money and conservation issues actually contradict the idea that the world grows together, and you can sort of compile any type of exhibition by getting loans from all over the world. That was my reaction to these very disparate lectures. Thank you.
I think about it because it does seem to me we don't need to talk to anyone. Okay. It does seem to be important to have to be able to hear the different points. But if you don't mind, I'll move on down the line because I have a number of other people. Dominic, you're next.
Right. I have a question on the welcome collections, actually taking up a point from Fredrik there, on the enormous long shelf life some exhibitions have. And I just wondered how you deal with the collection of welcome that is enormous and very particular, because in the slides that you've shown us of very fascinating new exhibitions, I saw very little material from Welcome's collections, I think, actually, and more newly commissioned art and outside artifacts, and I just wondered if that is your way of freeing yourself from the legacy of that collection to appeal, to maybe have a more global appeal with your newer exhibitions.
Well, the answer is that the trustees in the 1940s and I suppose the late 1930s solved the problem for us by giving most of the objects away on permanent loan. So the number of objects we have, in a sense, we've repatriated them from the Wellcome collections, particularly in the Science Museum. And so you will see one gallery which actually has many hundreds of Wellcome objects in it. And I think from time to time we will recycle those. But the answer is actually you will find Wellcome objects in museums around the world, from Australia to the United States. And it was collecting on an extraordinary scale. He had collectors collecting before him. It was a sort of 19th century model of collecting, where he had not the equivalent of not the Devine brothers, but the equivalent, I suppose. And I think that we will just change the objects around from time to time. The answer is that many of the objects in the Science Museum simply can't be on display. There are, for example, drawers after drawers of scalpels, of obstetric forceps, and actually you will see some of that in that we have one case which has amputation saws in it. We have another case which has forceps in it. And whilst one amputation saw has a certain meaning, when you see 30 of them together, then they acquire a different sort of meaning. They actually become much more artistic, actually, when you see them as a group. But what we've done with the Science Museum is we have actually put a number of them online now. So we have a big digitization project with explanation that goes with them.
Maria.
I mostly want to refer to what Fredrik said, and I hope that I'm clear and precise enough in English. I was struck by this idea of justification of the replacement of the object, so that it was always justified by saying that people were using it for superstitious reasons. And when I read your paper, I had the impression that this was almost some kind of topos. No. It was used again and again, and it was to say that we are taking this object now to take it into some Western enlightened context. So we are the ones who really understand to read it and know how to interpret it, and so it's justified to take it out of its context. And this is something that I've often met in the when I'm dealing with Islamic art, and even now in contemporary issues, in collecting Islamic art, or collecting, I'm saying it as neutral as I can, in post-war situations in Iraq and Afghanistan, when people are taking Islamic artifacts from their contexts and saying, well, the people there now, they really have other problems to solve, and they are not so much in touch with their history and culture, so it's better to take them into our context where we have standards to deal with them. So I just wanted to make this connection.
It is a purpose, and it's used, I mean, I saw it most blatantly used in Cambodia a couple of years ago, actually. But it's, if we talk about 18th century stuff in Ottoman Greece, I mean, it's bordering on contrafactual history. You could say, well, certain things were saved. Some things were probably not saved. A huge amount of what was taken has been lost. We think that all these things were taken and came into collections and we know where they are. This is not true. And there are, for instance, this is not in this paper, but there was a fair amount of Russian collectionism going on. Russian militaries during the expansion of the 18th century, and most of this stuff we had no idea where it turned up. It might still be in Russian mansions outside in the countryside, but they left no trace. So it is a topos, and I don't know what to say about the Islamic thing. I mean, maybe it's saved, maybe not. I don't know.
Okay, Susan.
See if I can remember what I was asking. I guess I just had something to add to this ownership question. It's a really interesting question to me. And it relates actually to indigenous items that are returned. And one of the issues that is coming up, certainly in Canada, is it's never just a simple return of objects to tribes, because within the tribes themselves, there's contestation over who actually owns this stuff. They might have been held jointly within a communal culture, but there's no real way of establishing who the ownership is. So there is contestation when they actually come back to the tribes themselves. And also, certainly, the question that these things are going to the elites of the tribes, and certain people contesting that. The other comment, I thought maybe I should bring Helen into this, and I'm really interested in this tension between specificity and generalization that seems to play itself out again and again. And I just think about it in terms of this human desire to make sense of things. Things are all very specific, but you try and build a storyline around it. And inevitably, that's what we do in museums. We try and build some kind of narrative that makes sense of all these little disparate things that happen in Croydon. I guess this isn't really a question. It's kind of a comment. It's a never-ending tension between movement and form, and I see institutionalization as the same kind of thing, a process that we try and break down, and the need for change comes out of that institutionalizing process, that sort of structure that we try to build into it. So I guess the last thing I want to say is, and I see that in museums very specifically, in the tension between exhibits, which are forced by their very nature to order, and this whole idea of the museum as a forum where dialogue and all of these various sort of complex and specific things are able to happen. So I really like your paper.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And it actually picks up very nicely, I think, from Susan's comment, because I wanted to ask Helen a question, or just maybe this is also just a comment, because I like that particular part of your paper. I like your paper, all of it. I'm not sure I understood all of the theoretical moves, but I really liked your basic theoretical landscape you were drawing up, and the section I really wanted to hear more about is what you didn't say much about here is the governmentality part, which I talked to you a little bit about yesterday, and because it was really interesting for me to have this look into the UK, the policy level. And this wonderful expression, you call it, that in the UK there's a policy level disinterest in the specific content of the museums, and I think this tension between specificity and universalism or whatever is really running through your paper and maybe through the conference theme. And I could and I can certainly see some of my own stuff in this about Danish museums wanting to bring up universal or general themes about the nature of war, whereas then there is a move in the other direction towards destinations, tourism places wanting to stress the uniqueness and the specificity of their own site. So there's this constant tension between these two, and I really like that thing brought out in your paper.
Sorry. Comment. Well, yeah, I mean, just on the governmentality issue, I mean, I think I'm just quite aware, because having worked on a project that was funded by a UK organisation called the Heritage Lottery Fund, which has its money from the, obviously money that's taken as a part of people's lottery donations, and it has a very governmental agenda in that the focus is on who's involved, and certain targeted populations are identified, how they're involved, so a very big focus on participation and active engagement, and trying to get institutions such as museums to respond to that sort of agenda. But what exactly is produced is almost beyond its concern. I mean, the HLF generally has taken a policy around not defining heritage and trying to encourage people who are making applications to make a case for what heritage is and why it's important. And there are lots of problems with that. But just on the governmentality thing, it means that their focus is primarily on who and how rather than on what. And I think one of the interesting things about the HLF is that it's been a explosion of knowledge produced in lots of different local contexts that aren't especially connected local contexts, but the knowledge produced are often of immense complexity, and I think are a kind of potential resource for sort of rethinking how kind of specificity is operating, if you like. I think the Museum of Croydon is a really interesting example. I mentioned it partly because I've worked there a lot. But the oral histories in the exhibition have been edited, or some of them have been edited in such a way that huge gulfs of kind of almost unarticulated complexity emerge. So one of the oral histories, again, of someone who at some points in her life has been classified as being learning disabled. She talks about collecting autographs from one of the venues where musicians used to travel in Croydon. She was working there, and she'd go and collect the autographs. But her mum ripped them up and told them it was rubbish, and that's the oral history clip. And to say that's because she's learned disabled would be to erase what I see as just this complexity of that oral history. But at the same time, and this is my question really, about how you interpret outwards from kind of specificity, if you like, specific memories, so that they're not just these kind of isolated moments. And I think that's why I'm interested in this kind of double Latour movement of localising the global and globalising the local, and trying to find ways in terms of museum practice to gesture towards those connections, so that in a sense the authenticity, the kind of authority of experience doesn't just sit there. We are able to sort of draw out politics from that.
Thanks. I have a very broad, maybe naive question, but I was going to ask it at some point. Was that I'm sympathetic to the sort of idea of global as like historical continuity, But I was still wondering, could you make is it possible to make would you make a difference between a Mediterranean world economy or economy monde, as it's been as global has been dealt with in your paper and some other occurrences, and maybe a sort of fast contemporary globalization, sort of in its accelerated move more recently, things similar, things different. And just a comment then following that, as looking at the Joseph Redler picture, I was thinking that it made me think of the reception, and that's part of, there's a question of a global reception would be, and it relates to, I suppose, to local international debate that's have been going on in the art world at the end of the 20th century, and maybe they've been going on for a much longer period of time as well, was that who will understand the painting? It will, if you send it to the US, and what is this tradition of like etc. with someone, the reception will be easier. But maybe if you send it somewhere where this tradition of psychoanalytics has not been going on, or even this modern sensibility possibly to artworks done in asylum, etc., which has a certain history, etc. Maybe then understanding would not be the same at any rate. And I'm saying this also with a footnote on, I was also thinking, but in Jung's work, there's like a metamorphosis of the soul and his symbols. There's quite a point made about all the similarity in images, so maybe that's not so true. So I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I think the images of mental health are very interesting, and I think you ask a good question. And I mean, one of the interests of that exhibition is actually people with our contemporary attitudes to mental history, looking back to see how people thought about it in at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, where actually there was a whole sort of artistic movement that was trying to express the inner mind in terms of what people looked like. But I think that if you look around the world and look at mental health today, mental health is one of the most stigmatized aspects of illness. And so it is just as biological as rheumatoid arthritis or cancer. We treat patients with cancer with sympathy. In many parts of the world, patients with mental health are just cast out on the street. So I think it's one of the powerful things of actually trying to look at images of mental health, because it forces people to look in and think about how they think of it. It would be interesting to take that exhibition to India or to Africa or to indeed China or North America. You would get very different perceptions, and I think it's why actually health is, I think, a very good subject for globalization, and is a very good museum topic actually.
Can I just say one word which interests me that seems to come out of what you've just said, and Gabrielle's question, that how is it possible to incorporate the reception or responses into the exhibition? Just as a broad question.
Well, I think that's very interesting. And one of the things you can do is you can collect audience feedback. And I think that can be quite powerful. And one of the things I'd encourage you to look at when you come to the Welcome Collection this evening is that we have two permanent galleries. One of them is Medicine Man, and that's Henry Wellcome's objects. That's where his collections are. The other is Medicine Now. And at the end of that gallery, we have postcards, and we encourage people to do drawings on them. And we have words on the back to stimulate their thoughts. And it's very powerful feedback, actually. So I think you can collect audience feedback. And I think it's the other reason for having events, actually. I think one's missing a trick if you have an exhibition and don't have as many events as you possibly can, so that so that people do have the opportunity to feed back. Because otherwise it is a bit sterile. People walk through, they may talk about it, and that's the end. I think you can get much more. But then it turns to your point, which is that actually we are in an extraordinarily unusual and fortunate position because we have money. And it's very difficult to run a museum without money, and we have it, and we're jolly lucky. But I also think that museums shouldn't necessarily view money as an entitlement. It is actually up to society to decide whether it wants to pay for museums or not, and there is no entitlement.
Thank you, Sharon.
Maybe more a rambling question. It was a thought that really occurred to me listening to Helen's and then thinking back to Mark's talk as well, which was, you raised this question about specificity, but actually if you look at museums now, there is quite a specific form that specificity is taking, which is this presentation of the individual. There's a kind of personalisation. So if you go into many museums now, you get all these pictures of people, of individuals, and I have to say I have very mixed feelings about this. You can see why that's going on one level, because it means you don't have to go and classify somebody as this or that, and you especially get it around ethnicity, so it's a great way of doing hybridity basically. So it gets you away from all those kind of categories. One thing I sometimes find when I go into these museums, you've got all these kind of, often these sort of smiley, jolly faces and things, and I've got a bit of a collection of pictures of these, is that I actually sometimes find it really annoying. So you have all these sort of just, the descriptions in some cases are just so short that they're very banal. And so I'm interested in what's going on there and what's picked out. And I think when you've got deeper kind of oral histories, you can do something else. So I'm interested in which ones work and which don't. And I think what's really interesting with the medical cases, so the woman with the heart and things, they seem to me to work very well in many ways. But why they work is also because of a kind of universalism coming in. So it's not like there's this specific and the not. It's that particular mix of how those come together that make these things sometimes work better than others is, I suppose is what seems to me. So I'm not sure that's a question, but it's just sort of reflection on this morning.
I mean, the first thing to say is I don't think these are either-ors. So I think there are universal objects like the Rosetta Stone, and I don't think the Rosetta Stone is made any better by having a smiley face behind it, or indeed the Elgin marbles. But I think that as humans we do relate very easily to other human stories. And so immediately the young woman, or the woman that you talked about whose mother tore up her autographs, I mean, we really feel sad about that. I mean, and I think the medical ones are very easy to relate to as well. And I think that if you look particularly at the stuff that we've got on show at the moment, a lot of that relates very closely to individuals, and we can relate to those individuals and we can have empathy to them. But I think one shouldn't mix the two things up, and I think there are certain objects that are universal that you shouldn't actually try to do that. If you were in the Welcome Gallery at the British Museum yesterday, there is one object in it which is very, very non-British Museum-like, very different, which is about the 20-foot long cabinet, which has got the two case histories of two people and all the pills that they took throughout their life. And personally, I think that works very well. And actually, if you go through that gallery, at any time, you will see people looking into that. So it really grips people. And isn't it just that we relate very well to individual stories, and actually we don't, on the whole, relate so well to the stories of populations?
I think there's more to it than that, though. I mean, I think that's part of it. But
sorry, go back to Sharon.
Just to say. Yeah, I mean, I do think that's part of it, and that's partly why it works. But I suppose in those cases, I absolutely agree, and I think that's what interests me. Why some do work and some seem to me not. And I suppose some of the ones that I find myself presenting, maybe I'm just grumpy, I don't know. But those are sometimes where you're given different individuals' interpretations of an object. Those sometimes I find, and they're often quite banal, and that, I suppose, I think is one of these instances of just this putting in of individuals. And I suppose there is also a bit of a sense of you are supposed to feel a sort of contact. And I sometimes think, well, I don't know that I want someone to tell me that I should have that.
But then don't you have... I think you have a choice there, and I think it comes back, when I was talking about this talk to Ken Arnold, I mean, he used the concept of the museum as social work. And there is an element of people coming into the museums who may actually appreciate some guidance about the nature of the objects and what other people think about them. So, some of us will form our own views. Actually, I find it quite helpful to put the sort of things in my ears and hear what people have to say about them. So I think it's a matter of choice, actually, and again, I don't think there's a right answer. Some people will prefer to form their own views of objects. other people will actually think, well, it's really helpful to have someone giving me their view, and even if it's a view that irritates me, and it often is, well, it makes you think about something.
Yeah, sometimes it works.
I just wanted to say again one little thing, which is that I think that cabinet, as you go through into the British Museum, the welcome cabinet, one of the fascinating things about it is you don't recognise initially what it is. And I'm wondering whether when we're thinking about the specificity of objects in relation to senses and perception, that non-recognition as a first stage might always be quite an important one. However, I want to pass on to somebody who has something to say. Oh, sorry, would you like to? Yeah, okay. Helen.
Yeah, I mean, just on the UK context, which maybe is quite specific in terms of how these problems are being managed, but in a way you can sort of see it as being a response to two critiques of the traditional 19th century mode of museology. One, in terms of the authorial voice of the museum and what that does to the production of knowledge, but the other being around governmentality, the kinds of subjectivities that are imagined to be produced through exhibition encounters. And in a sense, in the context of the 21st century, you've got this kind of I don't know, reorientating of those two critiques, if you like. So in a sense, the critique to the non-specific authorial voice has been addressed by getting more people into the gallery. But at the same time, then it's been mobilising a particular form of personhood, a particular form of, first-person, narrativity, which obviously increasingly is being, arguments being made, for example, by Nicholas Rose, as being interpolated into a kind of consumer notion of the individual. And so you've got a range of different kind of factors which are playing out in the different ways museums manage putting people's own histories and voices into the gallery. And I think this is the point about some of the ideas of scale that I was trying to introduce, is that if a comment is very simplistic and not allowed to go into a lot of detail, in a way that is just as general as saying it's about capitalism. And this would be the kind of shift that Latour tries to make. And that, in a sense, the kind of personal accounts in museums that work very well are ones which have space to not just do that, not just the kind of, I like it because red's my favourite colour type comment on a painting, but something that is given space for a different kind of narrativity. And I suppose, as someone who's done a lot of these kind of community history projects and used oral history a lot, and have often been working in museums that don't have the kind of global legacies in the same way as, say, the British Museum does, but have it in terms of diverse populations and local authority responsibilities they're trying to meet, is to try and find ways of practicing oral history and co-producing exhibitions that actually allow space for some of the non-resolvedness of life to be explored in some way, non-analytically resolved. So.
I think we probably want to stop fairly soon. I've got three more people who want to say something. Barry, I think you're trying to communicate something to me.
Yeah, it was on this point that we wanted to keep things in a sequence.
Yeah, you mean to come back to
Sharon's discussion with...
yeah. Do you want to come back
I just want to say to this about the individual people saying things in museums. I mean, I think I know what you mean, and I think also the problem is that, we have this authoritarian voice of the 19th century, but this is also, when you put up people like that, you negate your responsibility on the part of the museum to actually take the voice and explain the objects. So instead you bring in other people and you kind of decline responsibility. I think this is what I often feel when I see these people. Yeah, but why don't they have the courage to say, why doesn't the museum state their point? I don't know.
Isn't there also something about what is the exhibit? So in some cases it's the voice that is the exhibit itself. And I think that's the case with what we put on at the Welcome collection. I think that's the case with the oral histories. And then there's when the voice is actually commenting on something else, and that's just a slightly different relationship. It's part of the exhibit, but it's not the exhibit itself.
Barry, do you want to come in next, and then Sam, and then coffee?
Yeah, I thought that it's not so hard to understand these things, but a few other factors we have to bring in. Why does it work when we have an individual? It works when the individual exemplifies something very general. So that's the case of the heart, and we see why that works. And so I agree with Sharon that when you're just putting up faces and people's reactions, that's not doing that at all. But the second thing that probably works and why you want the individuals in there has to do with the psychology of learning. It turns out from animal studies and obviously from us that people are actually able to learn much better when they're watching someone else being taught than being taught themselves. And actually, if you have the other individuals accessing and route in, that gives you a terrifically good access and a non-directional access. You're not being sort of getting this, you're not being dictated to. And I think museums work very well when it's more about showing than saying, when you're not just getting the screen and a bunch of information to read. So I think that's actually a bit of psychology, and the people may not know why they're doing it, but when they get it right, it works for that reason, I think.
Sally. I wanted to thank you. I wanted to ask Helen, or sort of make a comment and turn it into a question. I love the idea of the sense of scale, and I was interested that you showed the oral history presented on the web. And I suppose my question was, does the certificate for this individual become a much larger object if it's presented, if the technology changes as to how it's presented, if it's made available on a wider scale? And sort of associated with that, does the fact that these technologies of the web allow for individuals to comment, to give feedback, to take part in the debate as part of, also increase that scale?
Yeah, I think this links back to whether or not we think about specific objects or specific oral histories as exemplifying something bigger, or whether we see them as something which isn't something that can be fitted in a very clear way into a pre-existing order, however that's defined, including the universal values, or whether it's something which is a kind of an instance or something that just creates a context for thinking about things differently. And I think that matters because that is a different kind of epistemological context for exhibiting work. So in that sense, the certificate, I mean, it's been rescaled through the process of being put in an exhibition simply because it is more connected now. More people will see it than would be seen otherwise. It doesn't necessarily mean that it becomes a big object, because it's not necessarily put in that analytic context by the exhibition itself. What I think the question is, and this is my kind of question about museum according approach, which in so many ways is being very important museologically in terms of social history in the UK, is that it relies in large part on the implied authority of experience to underpin the exhibition, and the context for each particular object, because they're located lower down the interpretive hierarchy, go off in lots of different directions. And so inequalities that might be, that might have some kind of connection cannot in the exhibition themselves be connected. And I think that's the big question about whether or not in the exhibition everything needs to be explained, and to some extent it doesn't need to be resonant in a way that might provoke certain kinds of thoughts. But the problem with oral history, the problem with any kind of personal account in the contemporary world is that these are being interpolated in so many political contexts all the time. We are living in a world where kind of consumer capitalism, those kind of ways of thinking is one way of thinking about how the eye has been reoperated. And so museums can't mobilise the eye outside of those contexts, which is why I'm quite interested in this kind of multiple movement and trying to trace out, as well as just have the eye sort of sitting there in the exhibition as if it can do that work on its own. And I think given that the eye exists in so many other contexts, I don't think it necessarily can, which is where the danger of politics, being aware of material inequality, which is what I mean by that, is lost.
But, can I comment? Because I don't think scale is the right word. I think this is about impact, actually. So it seems to me that a certificate in a junk shop has no impact at all. Once you associate it with a story, it starts having more impact. Once you put it on the web, then it has the potential to have even more impact. And I think a lot of what we've been talking about is impact. I don't think it's scale at all.
Uta, did you want to, can you be really, really quick? Because although I think the principle is you want to have coffee when you've still got more to say and you want to go on to the next thing, but we need to have coffee.
Just an attempt to actually link, especially Helen's
Sorry, wait till you get the microphone.
It was really an attempt to link Helen's paper to Valentina's paper, both of which I enjoyed, well, all of them I enjoyed very much, and also Thomasson, which is really thinking about scale, not so much in terms of interpretation of the object in the museum, but scale in terms of how scale and speed, how fast the global world actually moves today, and at what different speeds different actors in the world move. And you mentioned, Valentina, that the museum could be a very good actor in cultural diplomacy, but you also brought up such a case like, for example, the block hour painting. And of course you have the speed of the art market, and you have the speed of the museum. And I think what is a real issue is that actually the art market is getting faster by the day, and the museum is also getting slower. And it results in a very problematic way how you actually get things into the museum. And well, in your paper, Christie's, for example, was a very negative effect on the one hand because they dispersed collections. But then actually Christie's was negotiating getting the block painting into the Royal Gallery. So I think that's really within the scope of the museum and globalisation, something we should really think about in terms of scale and speed.
Thank you for your extremely interesting question, and I think that your point is an excellent one, and indeed I didn't have the time to explore this issue more specifically, the interaction between development, economic development, and the role that museums may play not only in cultural development but also in the economic development of certain countries, and vis-à-vis the role that private actors and auction houses have in the art market. In another paper that I am going to publish this month, I mean it should appear soon, I deal with the interplay between international investment law and underwater cultural heritage, and in that paper I propose a model, just a cooperative model between states and private actors, according to which underwater cultural heritage has certain specificities in the sense that you may create a sort of joint venture, because when they are at the bottom of the sea, you may structure contracts between states and private actors, and these contracts already exist. So basically it's not something which I'm just proposing out of the blue. It's something which has already been done, for instance, by the UK with the recovery of an ancient shipwreck. I can't remember the name, but the UK has already implemented this sort of pilot project. And there are other countries which are implementing this sort of synergy. And so, in a sense, the state and public museums may dialogue or interact with private actors, because I just briefly mentioned in my presentation that, of course, selling the artifact is not the only option. You may have revenues also through the exhibitions and so on. For instance, I mentioned in the paper the Titanic example. So they are not just exploring the deep seabed anymore, because they have these exhibitions which are extremely rewarding. And so, if we look at the things from a different perspective, we might elaborate solutions and so on. And so it's not something completely new. And I really hope that will be a possible option. But your question is very on the point. Thank you for...
Thank you very much to everybody who's spoken in the discussion, and a very big thank you again to our speakers.